No one in that town expected mercy to come from a woman with nothing left to lose. She was homeless, hungry, and invisible, sleeping in doorways most people crossed the street to avoid. And yet on that cold afternoon, when a biker's daughter collapsed, and the world seemed to freeze, it was that same ignored grandmother who dropped to her knees and fought death with her bare hands. Around them, engines idled, leather jackets crowded in, and suspicion hung in the air thick as smoke. What happened next would not just divide the town. It would shame it, heal it, and change it forever. In that small town, reputation mattered more than truth, and fear traveled faster than facts. Outsiders were labeled before they spoke, judged before they were known. And among all the people quietly tolerated, but never truly accepted, one woman stood at the very bottom of the town's invisible ladder. The grandmother had not always lived on the streets. Once, she had known warmth that came from more than just layers of worn clothing. Life, however, had thinned her joys one hardship at a time. First went her husband. Then went her home. Then went the family who could no longer afford to hold her together with their own broken pieces, until one day, she became what the town liked to pretend did not exist. Another forgotten soul with nowhere to go. She settled near the edge of downtown, where tourists passed and locals hurried by, eyes fixed forward. Some called her names under their breath, others warned their children not to get too close, and most simply pretended she wasn't real. A few streets away, another world thrived, loud, proud and untouchable. The bikers ruled the highway like kings of steel, known for their thunderous engines and the fear they casually carried with them. Their presence filled restaurants and emptied sidewalks. People respected them not because they knew them, but because they were afraid not to. On that day, they had gathered for one of their public rides, an event that drew crowds from miles away, and among them rode one of the few people who made the toughest bikers soften. Their brother's teenage daughter. Bright, full of life, and always smiling, she was the last person anyone expected to see fall. The town buzzed with excitement until it didn't. Within minutes, joy would turn to panic, and panic would give way to something much darker. And at the center of it all would stand the one person no one thought mattered at all. The moment she fell, confusion swept through the crowd like a sudden storm. 1 second, the girl had been walking beside the row of motorcycles, laughing and alive. The next, she was on the pavement, motionless, her body at an unnatural angle that made people instantly look away. The music from nearby speakers was cut mid-note. Conversations dissolved into gasps. Someone shouted for help, while others froze, unsure what they were even seeing. The bikers moved first, shoving through the crowd in disbelief. Panic lit their faces, men who were feared everywhere suddenly helpless in the place that mattered most. Someone tried shaking the girl. Another yelled for an ambulance. A third stood there in shock, as if refusing to accept that this was real. People reached for phones. Some to call for help, others to record, and still, no one touched her the way she needed to be touched. No one, until the grandmother appeared. She hadn't been part of the crowd. She had been sitting near a storefront down the street, unnoticed as usual, watching the world pass her by. When the noise shifted from laughter to fear, she looked up. What she saw made her rise without hesitation. She moved quickly, ignoring the whispers that followed her like shadows. People stared as she dropped her thin bag on the ground. No one invited her closer. No one made space for her. But she stepped forward anyway, eyes locked on the girl's still chest, on lips that had gone pale far too fast. And then she knelt. Some in the crowd bristled. Others scoffed. A few even murmured that she should step back. After all, what could a homeless old woman possibly do that trained professionals could not? But the grandmother did not look at them. She placed her hands exactly where they needed to be and began to press. Her movements were steady, certain. Not rushed. Not frantic. As if her body remembered something her life had not been allowed to forget. Each push carried purpose. Each breath she gave came with quiet determination. Around her, the crowd fractured. Some prayed. Some doubted. Some watched with folded arms. A few shook their heads in judgment, like they had already decided the ending of this story before it could finish being told. Among the bikers, tension burned like fuel. They did not know what to feel: gratitude, fear, or suspicion. Some stared at her in disbelief, others in quiet rage. How could they trust this woman they had never trusted before with the one thing they loved most? Minutes crawled by. The ambulance still hadn't arrived. The girl did not move. And then, as if to answer the weight of the entire town's breath being held at once, her body jerked. Just slightly. A soft gasp whispered from her lips. The grandmother did not celebrate. She did not pause. She kept going, as if she knew this moment alone was not enough. When the girl finally pulled in a real breath, loud and uneven sound erupted from the crowd. Not cheers. Not applause. Something rawer. Something closer to relief wrestling with shock. And that was when the bikers stepped closer. Faces that once frightened strangers now revealed something else entirely: fear of loss. Gratitude twisted into something heavier, something dangerous. Because while the girl was breathing, the grandmother was suddenly visible, and for a town built on silent judgments and whispered prejudice, visibility was never neutral. The sirens finally tore through the air like a warning the town had waited too long to hear. Red and blue lights spilled across chrome and concrete, painting the scene in flashing urgency. Paramedics rushed in and took over, their hands moving fast, their voices clipped and controlled. The grandmother stepped back without a word, quietly surrendering the girl to trained arms. Her job, as far as she was concerned, was done. But the town's reckoning was just beginning. As the ambulance doors slammed shut and sped away, the energy shifted. What had been fear now turned into something heavier, thicker. The crowd's attention no longer followed the girl. It turned, slowly and unmistakably, toward the grandmother. She stood there alone, her clothes worn thin, her hands still trembling, the same hands that moments before had pulled a child back from the edge of death. The bikers closed in. Boots against pavement sounded louder than engines ever had. Leather vests, tattoos, hard eyes. The very men people crossed streets to avoid were now forming a wall in front of the smallest, weakest-looking person there. Some in the crowd held their breath, expecting violence. Others leaned in, ready to witness retribution instead of redemption. In a town that had taught itself to expect the worst from people who looked like her, no one imagined this would end gently. The grandmother did not run. She did not beg. She did not explain herself. She simply stood there, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. And then something unexpected happened. The first biker removed his helmet. Then another, and another. One by one, the hardest men in the town uncovered their faces, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling. Shame. A silence fell that was louder than any engine. The same men who had been feared for years now looked suddenly human, vulnerable, stripped of the armor the town had built around them, and standing across from them was the woman the town had never bothered to know. No one spoke. No one needed to. The truth had already done the talking. That a life had been saved by someone everyone else had already discarded. That the town's ugliest assumptions had been laid bare in the open air. And that in the moment that mattered most, the weakest person in the room had become the strongest. The crowd no longer saw a homeless woman. They saw a mirror, and they did not like what it showed. The crowd did not rush her, no hands grabbed, no voices rose. What remained was a silence thick with consequence. The grandmother bent down, picked up her small, worn bag, and turned as if she intended to leave the same way she had always lived, quietly, unseen, unchanged by a world that rarely changed for her. But she did not make it far. The town moved this time, not with noise, not with spectacle, with weight. People who had never spoken to her before suddenly looked straight at her. People who had crossed the street now crossed space. No announcements were made, no speeches delivered. Yet something unmistakable began to shift. The looks that had once been sharp with suspicion softened into something unfamiliar recognition. And the bikers, those men the town had always feared, did not walk away. They stood there longer than anyone expected, not towering, not threatening, just standing, as if guarding something fragile, as if afraid that if they moved too quickly, the moment might break. Later that evening, word traveled faster than truth ever had in that town. What she had done, how she had done it, where she had come from, and for the first time in years, people did not reduce her to a label. They spoke her into being. By morning, the town looked different, not in its buildings, in its eyes. The grandmother did not suddenly become rich. Her past did not vanish. Her pain did not reverse itself. But something just as powerful happened. She was no longer invisible. And once a wronged person becomes visible, a town can never claim ignorance again. The girl lived. And the story lived longer than any engine's roar. It lived in small changes. Doors that opened instead of closed. Names spoken instead of avoided. Kindness given instead of calculated. The town learned something it could never unlearn. That dignity does not come from power. That heroism does not wear uniforms. And that sometimes the person the world teaches you to fear is the very one who saves you. The grandmother walked back to her corner with the same feet, but she no longer stood on the same ground. Because after that day, the town could never pretend it didn't see her, and neither can we. So the only question that remains is this: how many lives have we walked past, simply because we decided not to see them?